The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Zara Williams shuffled into courtroom 3B, her wrists bound by cold metal shackles that clinked with each deliberate step. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on her petite frame, and she had spent careful minutes that morning messing her natural hair into an appropriately troubled appearance. Every detail mattered in this performance, one that had taken months to orchestrate. Case number 2024, JV 8847, People vs. Zara Williams. The bailiff announced in a monotone voice that had clearly recited thousands of similar cases. Judge Harrison Whitmore barely glanced up from his paperwork, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his black robes pristine. At 62, he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had never been challenged, never been questioned. His pale blue eyes swept over Zara with the kind of dismissive assessment she had witnessed him perform countless times before, though he had no idea she had been watching. "Another one from the projects, I see," Judge Whitmore muttered, loud enough for the court reporter to catch but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. "Petty theft, shoplifting from a convenience store. How original." Zara kept her eyes downcast, playing the part of the ashamed teenager. Inside, her Harvard-trained mind was cataloging every word, every inflection, every micro-expression. This was exactly what she had been waiting for, the casual racism that flowed from his lips like poison from a broken pipe. "Miss Williams," the judge continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "I suppose you think this is all just a game? That you can steal whatever you want and society will just pat you on the head and send you home to your... what is it? Single mother." The courtroom was nearly empty except for a few other families waiting their turn. A tired-looking public defender shuffling through files, and one woman in the back row whose presence Zara felt like a warm embrace. Her mother, Dr. Patricia Williams, a retired professor who had raised her daughter to believe that intelligence was the greatest weapon against injustice. What Judge Whitmore didn't know, what no one in this sterile room knew, was that the troubled 17-year-old before him was actually Dr. Zara Williams, 28 years old, Harvard Law School graduate, and one of the most promising civil rights attorneys on the East Coast. For the past 6 months, she had been living a carefully constructed lie, building a false identity, gathering evidence of the systematic racism that plagued the juvenile justice system like a cancer. Today's hearing wasn't just another case. It was the culmination of her investigation, the final piece of evidence she needed to bring down a system that had destroyed too many young lives, including her brother's. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Miss Williams?" Judge Whitmore's voice cut through the stale courtroom air, but Zara's mind drifted to another time, another place. The cramped 2-bedroom apartment where she and Marcus had shared dreams bigger than their circumstances. 16 years old, acceptance letter trembling in her hands. "Mama, I got into Harvard. The scholarship was full, tuition, room, board, everything." Marcus, only 14 then, had whooped with joy, spinning her around their tiny kitchen. "My sister's gonna be a lawyer. She's gonna change the world." "I asked you a question," the judge snapped, jolting her back to the present. "No, Your Honor," Zara mumbled, maintaining her facade while her Harvard-trained mind processed every nuance of his tone, every tell that revealed his prejudice. Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk playing across his lips. "Of course not. Personal responsibility isn't exactly a strong suit in your community. Is it? Let me guess. Broken home, absent father, mother working multiple jobs just to keep food on the table." Each word was a calculated blow, designed to diminish and dehumanize. But Zara had heard these same words before, directed at another young black defendant in this very courtroom. 3 years ago, Marcus, 17 and terrified, standing where she stood now. The same orange jumpsuit, the same shackles, the same condescending tone from Judge Whitmore. "Another product of a broken system," the judge had said then. "These people never learn." Marcus had been sentenced to 18 months for a crime he didn't commit, a convenience store robbery where the real perpetrator was caught on camera but never pursued because Marcus fit the description better. "You see, Miss Williams," Judge Whitmore continued, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of a lecture, The problem with young people like you is that you think the world owes you something. You think you can take whatever you want without consequences. Marcus had died 6 months into his sentence. Suicide? The official report claimed. But the bruises on his body told a different story. The investigation was perfunctory. The case closed quickly. Another young black life lost to a system that saw him as disposable. Zara's preparation for this moment had been meticulous. For years of fighting institutional racism in courtrooms across the country had taught her that evidence was everything. She had spent months creating her false identity, studying Judge Whitmore's patterns, documenting his discriminatory sentencing practices. She had recordings of his private conversations, testimonies from dozens of families, statistical analyses proving his bias. The tragedy, the judge droned on, is that you probably had potential once. But when you choose crime over education, when you choose the easy path over hard work, this is where you end up. If only he knew, Zara thought, that the criminal before him had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law at 24, that she had clerked for a Supreme Court justice, that she had won landmark civil rights cases that changed federal policy. But today, she was just another black girl in an orange jumpsuit, and Judge Whitmore was about to reveal exactly who he really was. Judge Whitmore's eyes narrowed as he studied Zara's appearance with the clinical detachment of someone examining a specimen. "Look at you," he said, his voice gaining momentum like a train building speed toward destruction. "That hair, that attitude, that complete lack of respect for this institution. It's written all over your face. The defiance, the entitlement." Zara kept her head bowed, but her fingers twitched slightly against the metal table. Each word was a dagger, precisely aimed and deliberately cruel. "Your Honor," the public defender, David Chun, interjected weakly from his position at the adjacent table. His rumpled suit and tired eyes spoke of a man who had long ago stopped fighting a system that seemed designed to crush hope. "My client is still a minor, and this is her first offense. First offense we know about." Judge Whitmore cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Mr. Chun, in my 30 years on this bench, I've seen hundreds of cases just like this one. These people," he gestured toward Zara as if she were an object rather than a human being, "they're genetically predisposed to this kind of behavior. It's in their DNA, their culture, their very nature." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. In the gallery, Patricia Williams gripped the wooden bench so tightly her knuckles went white. She watched her brilliant daughter, the child who had read Dostoevsky at age 10, who had debated constitutional law with professors twice her age, sit silently while this man reduced her to a racist stereotype. "The science is clear," Judge Whitmore continued, warming to his theme. "Certain populations simply lack the cognitive capacity for long-term planning, for understanding consequences. They operate on impulse, on immediate gratification. It's why programs and rehabilitation efforts fail so consistently with this demographic." Zara's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. Her Harvard training had prepared her for legal battles, but nothing could have prepared her for the psychological assault of having her humanity systematically dismantled by someone in a position of absolute authority. "People like her," the judge said, his voice dripping with disgust, "are a burden on society. They drain resources, commit crimes, produce more criminals. The cycle never ends because they're incapable of breaking it themselves." David Chin shuffled his papers nervously but said nothing. His silence was as damning as the judge's words. Another cog in a machine designed to process black and brown bodies through a system that had already decided their guilt. Patricia Williams closed her eyes, fighting back tears. She trusted her daughter's plan, believed in the justice Zara sought to deliver. But watching this humiliation unfold was almost unbearable. The weight of every racist encounter, every microaggression, every systemic barrier they had faced as a family seemed to crystallize in this moment. Zara's breathing remained steady, but inside, her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. While Judge Whitmore's venomous words filled the courtroom, Maria Santos shifted uncomfortably in the gallery's second row, her weathered hands clutching a worn photograph of her son Miguel. She had sat in this same courtroom 8 months ago, watching the same judge sentence her boy to 2 years for vandalism, spray painting an abandoned building. Just last week, she had read in the local paper about 3 white teenagers from the affluent Riverside district who received community service for the exact same offense. "It's always the same," she whispered to the man beside her, James Thompson, whose dark skin bore the stress lines of a father who had fought the system and lost. "They see our children as criminals before they even speak." James nodded grimly, his eyes fixed on Zara. "My daughter Keisha was denied bail for shoplifting, $50 worth of makeup. Said she was a flight risk." His voice cracked slightly. That same week, a white girl from the suburbs got released on her own recognizance for stealing 3 times as much. Behind the court reporter's desk, Linda Hayes's fingers moved steadily across her stenotype machine, capturing every word of Judge Whitmore's racist tirade. At 58, she had been documenting injustice in this courtroom for over 2 decades, her dark eyes witnessing countless young lives destroyed by prejudice masquerading as justice. She had files at home, unofficial records of sentencing disparities, transcripts of inappropriate comments, patterns of discrimination that painted a damning picture of systematic bias. "Someone needs to stop him," Maria whispered, watching as Judge Whitmore continued his assault on Zara's character. Linda's fingers paused momentarily on her machine. She had been waiting years for someone with the courage and resources to challenge Judge Whitmore's reign of terror. As she watched the young woman in the orange jumpsuit maintain her composure under such vicious attack, something stirred in her chest. A flicker of hope that perhaps, finally, someone was ready to fight back. The tension in the room was palpable, decades of accumulated injustice pressing down like a weight that threatened to crush them all. But in that suffocating atmosphere, Linda sensed something different about today, something that made her lean forward slightly, her experienced eyes studying Zara Williams with newfound interest. Linda Hayes's fingers froze above her stenotype machine as Judge Whitmore leaned forward, his pale eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. The courtroom fell into an expectant silence, the kind that precedes either salvation or devastation. "Miss Williams," the judge began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "After careful consideration of your case, your background, and your complete lack of remorse, I hereby sentence you to 6 months in the Riverside Juvenile Detention Center." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Maria Santos covered her mouth in horror. She had seen white teenagers walk away with community service for identical charges just weeks before. James Thompson's hands clenched into fists, his daughter's denied bail suddenly feeling like a gentle mercy compared to this travesty. 6 months for shoplifting candy bars? David Chun finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Judge Whitmore's smile was cold and predatory. "Mr. Chun, this young woman represents everything that's wrong with her community. The attitude problem, the complete lack of respect for authority, the inability to accept responsibility. These are not isolated incidents but symptoms of a deeper pathological condition." Zara's breathing remained steady, but her heart thundered in her chest. This was it, the moment she had orchestrated the final piece of evidence that would destroy him. But as his words washed over her, she couldn't help thinking of Marcus, of all the young people who had sat in this chair before her with no Harvard degree to protect them. No plan for justice, no hope for vindication. Furthermore, Judge Whitmore continued, his voice rising with evangelical fervor, "I believe the state should seriously consider implementing sterilization programs for repeat offenders from these demographics. If we could prevent more criminals like her from reproducing, we might actually make progress in cleaning up our communities." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Even David Chen's jaw dropped open. Linda Hayes's hands trembled as she transcribed the words that would end Judge Whitmore's career, while Patricia Williams gripped the bench so hard she thought it might splinter. But Zara Williams, Dr. Zara Williams, simply sat in silence, her mind recording every syllable of the most damning evidence any civil rights attorney could hope for. The trap was set. The prey had walked willingly into the snare. Now it was time to spring it. The bailiff, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, rose from his position near the wall and began walking toward Zara, handcuffs jangling from his belt. The sound echoed through the silent courtroom like a death knell, each step bringing him closer to what everyone assumed would be another young black life swallowed by the system. But as his shadow fell across her table, Zara Williams stood. Not the shuffling, defeated rise of a broken teenager, but the confident, commanding posture of someone who had argued before the Supreme Court. Her spine straightened, her shoulders squared, and when she spoke, her voice cut through the courtroom air like a blade through silk. "Your Honor," she said, her words crisp and articulate, each syllable precisely enunciated with the authority of someone who had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School. "Before you finalize this sentence, I believe this court should know exactly who stands before you." Judge Whitmore's smug expression faltered. The voice didn't match the defendant. This wasn't the broken dialect he expected from people like her. This was the voice of education, of power, of someone who belonged in his world. "My name is Dr. Zara Williams," she continued, reaching into a hidden pocket of her jumpsuit and producing a leather portfolio that had somehow escaped the bailiff's search. "I am a graduate of Harvard Law School, class of 2021, summa cum laude. I am a member of the Massachusetts Bar, the federal bar, and I specialize in civil rights litigation." The courtroom exploded. Maria Santos gasped audibly. James Thompson leaned forward in disbelief. Linda Hayes's fingers flew across her machine, capturing every word of what she knew would be the most important transcript of her career. Judge Whitmore's face drained of color as Zara spread her credentials across the defendant's table. Her Harvard diploma, her bar certification, her civil rights attorney license, all bearing her real name and photograph. "For the past 6 months," Zara announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the stunned courtroom, "I have been conducting an undercover investigation into systematic racism within this jurisdiction's juvenile justice system. Every word you have spoken today, every racist comment, every discriminatory statement, has been recorded and documented." She produced a small recording device, its red light blinking steadily. "Including your suggestion that people like me should be sterilized to prevent us from reproducing." Judge Whitmore's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that the very air seemed to vibrate with electricity. "I have evidence of your discriminatory sentencing patterns spanning 5 years," Zara continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. "Statistical analyses proving racial bias, recordings of your private conversations expressing racist views, and testimonies from 47 families whose children were wrongfully sentenced in this courtroom." The bailiff had stopped mid-stride, his handcuffs forgotten. Patricia Williams was crying openly now, but these were tears of pride, not anguish. "Most importantly," Zara said, her voice breaking slightly for the first time, "I have evidence regarding the wrongful conviction and subsequent death of Marcus Williams, my 17-year-old brother, who died in juvenile detention after you sentenced him for a crime he didn't commit." The silence that followed was deafening, pregnant with the weight of justice finally arriving. The silence that followed Zara's revelation lasted only heartbeats before it shattered like glass against stone. Maria Santos was the first to stand, her weathered hands still clutching Miguel's photograph, her voice trembling but determined. "My son Miguel," she began, her accent thick with emotion. 2 years for spray paint while white boys got community service for the same thing. You destroyed my family, Judge Whitmore." Her words broke the dam. James Thompson rose next, his deep voice carrying the weight of a father's anguish. "My daughter Keisha, denied bail for $50 of makeup while white girls walked free. She lost her job, her apartment, her future. All because you saw a criminal instead of a child. One by one they stood. Mrs. Chun, whose nephew received 18 months for possession while white college students got warnings. Mr. Rodriguez, whose daughter was sentenced as an adult at 16 while white defendants remained in juvenile court. Each voice added to a growing chorus of testimony that filled the courtroom with decades of suppressed truth. Linda Hayes rose from behind her stenotype machine, her professional composure finally cracking. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I have been documenting your discriminatory practices for 23 years. I have files, transcripts, statistical analyses, all waiting for someone brave enough to use them." Judge Whitmore's face had gone from pale to ashen. "Order!" he shouted, banging his gavel frantically. "I will hold you all in contempt. Bailiff, clear this courtroom." But the bailiff stood frozen, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was unfolding. Through the courtroom doors, reporters began flooding in. Zara's legal team had alerted the media the moment her identity was revealed. Camera flashes popped like lightning as journalists captured the historic moment when decades of institutional racism finally faced its reckoning. "You cannot silence us anymore," Zara declared, her voice rising above the chaos. "The truth has a voice, and today it speaks through all of us." Judge Whitmore's gavel fell silent. His authority, built on a foundation of prejudice and protected by institutional power, crumbled before the unstoppable force of collective courage. The families continued speaking, their voices weaving together into a tapestry of injustice that could no longer be ignored. Outside, federal investigators were already pulling into the courthouse parking lot. Their arrival the beginning of the end for Judge Harrison Whitmore's reign of terror. The courthouse steps had transformed into a battlefield of justice, with federal agents moving through the crowd like surgeons, excising a cancer that had metastasized through the entire judicial system. Agent Sarah Martinez, her silver badge catching the afternoon sunlight, led a team of FBI investigators who had been monitoring Zara's undercover operation for the past month, waiting for exactly this moment to strike. Inside courtroom 3B, the scene was surreal. Judge Harrison Whitmore, who had wielded absolute power over countless young lives for 3 decades, now sat hunched in his chair like a deflated balloon. His black robes, once symbols of authority and respect, hung on his diminished frame like a costume from a play that had finally ended. "Harrison Whitmore," Agent Martinez announced, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "You are under arrest for violation of civil rights under color of law, conspiracy to deny equal protection under the 14th Amendment, and judicial misconduct in the first degree." The Miranda rights that followed seemed to echo in the cavernous courtroom, each word a nail in the coffin of his career. The gavel that had once been his weapon of choice lay silent on the bench, its power forever broken. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Whitmore's eyes met Zara's for one final moment. Gone was the smug superiority, replaced by the hollow stare of a man who had finally been held accountable for his crimes. Zara watched the arrest with a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion that ran bone deep. 6 months of living a lie, of enduring humiliation and racist attacks, of carrying the weight of her brother's memory. It all culminated in this moment of justice. But as the adrenaline began to fade, she felt the full emotional toll of what she had endured. Patricia Williams pushed through the crowd of reporters and investigators, her eyes locked on her daughter. When she reached Zara, she pulled her into an embrace that spoke of months of worry, sleepless nights, and overwhelming pride. "My brilliant, brave girl," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Marcus would be so proud of what you've done." The mention of her brother's name hit Zara like a physical blow. She had carried his memory through every moment of this investigation. But now, in the aftermath of victory, the grief felt fresh and raw. "I just wish he could see this," she said, her voice barely audible above the chaos surrounding them. Around them, the families who had found their voices were already organizing, their shared trauma transforming into collective action. Maria Santos, still clutching Miguel's photograph, exchanged contact information with James Thompson, their bond forged in the fire of injustice but strengthened by hope for change. Mrs. Chun spoke rapidly in Mandarin to her husband on her phone, sharing news that would ripple through their community like stones thrown into still water. Linda Hayes, the court reporter who had silently documented decades of discrimination, stood beside a table covered with boxes of evidence. Transcripts, recordings, statistical analyses that painted a damning picture of systematic bias. Federal investigators carefully cataloged each piece, understanding that this case would likely trigger investigations in courtrooms across the country. "This is bigger than just Judge Whitmore," Agent Martinez explained to Zara as they walked toward the courthouse exit. "Your evidence has already prompted us to open investigations in 12 other jurisdictions. We're looking at a pattern of discrimination that spans multiple states." The courthouse steps buzzed with activity as news vans arrived and reporters set up their equipment. Zara found herself at the center of a media storm, microphones thrust toward her face, cameras capturing every expression. The questions came rapid fire. How long have you been planning this? What made you decide to go undercover? What do you say to critics who claim you entrapped the judge? But Zara's attention was drawn to the families gathering behind the reporters. Dozens of parents, siblings, and community members who had been touched by Judge Whitmore's prejudice. They held photographs of their children, signs demanding justice, and expressions of hope that had been absent from their faces for far too long. This is just the beginning, Zara told the crowd, her voice carrying both triumph and determination. Judge Whitmore's removal is a victory, but it's one battle in a much larger war. Across this country, there are judges, prosecutors, and police officers who see young black and brown faces and assume guilt before innocence. We cannot stop fighting until every child receives equal justice under the law. The cameras captured her words, broadcasting them to a nation that was finally ready to confront uncomfortable truths about justice in America. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #ZaraWilliams, turning her story into a rallying cry for reform. But as the crowd began to disperse and the immediate chaos subsided, Zara felt the weight of what lay ahead. One corrupt judge was gone, but the system that had enabled him remained largely intact. Thousands of young people were still trapped in cycles of injustice across the country, their futures determined by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. David Chun, the public defender who had failed to protect her during the hearing, approached hesitantly. "Dr. Williams," he said, his voice heavy with shame, "I want you to know that I'm resigning from my position. What happened today? I should have fought harder for you, for all of them." Zara studied his face, seeing genuine remorse in his tired eyes. "Mr. Chun," she said finally, "the system failed you too, but now you have a chance to be part of the solution. Don't run from this. Use it to become the advocate these children deserve." As the sun began to set over the courthouse, casting long shadows across the steps where history had been made, Zara Williams stood with her mother and looked toward the future. Marcus's death would not be in vain if they continued fighting for every child who would follow. Change was coming, one courtroom at a time, and she would be there to ensure it happened. The revolution had begun with a single voice speaking truth to power, but it would continue with a chorus of voices demanding justice for all.